The streak of blood across the scorching desert stone should have made him turn back. But in the heavy Arizona heat, Ethan followed the trail anyway, weaving through the cracked red rocks until he found it. A tiny, trembling creature covered in jet-black fur. He didn't know it yet, but the moment he carried that helpless thing home was the moment a beautiful and terrifying chapter of the desert began. The Arizona summer had a way of swallowing sound, leaving nothing but the low hum of heat rising off the red desert rock. Ethan Hale, 35 and far older in the ways that mattered, stood outside his small cabin at the edge of Tonto National Forest, letting the evening wind cool the sweat on his back. Nights here could turn sharp and cold even after brutal days, a contrast he secretly liked. It reminded him that the world could shift in an instant, a truth he had learned the hard way. He was heading back inside when something caught his eye on the sandstone near the trail. An irregular pattern, a darker stain against the orange dust. Ethan crouched down, frowning. It wasn't oil. It wasn't runoff. It was blood. Small droplets, scattered, then more concentrated, as if something had stumbled, paused, struggled. His pulse tightened. Injured wildlife wasn't unusual here, but the pattern, it looked too deliberate, too small. He followed the trail toward a narrow break between two boulders. The deeper he went, the colder the air felt. A desert night could drop to 40 degrees in minutes, and whatever left those marks might not survive the next hour. Ethan's boots rubbed softly against the stone as he stepped into the shadow of the rocks, and for a moment there was only silence, until a sound so faint he almost missed it brushed against the edge of his hearing. A tiny, raspy whimper. He lowered himself to the ground and angled his flashlight inside. At first he saw nothing. Then the beam caught something curled against the far wall of the crevice, a small, trembling shape no bigger than his hand. Its fur was soaked with dried blood and dust, but beneath the grime was a color Ethan had never seen on any desert creature. Deep, ink-black fur that shimmered faintly, like wet obsidian under the moonlight. Strange, beautiful, completely out of place. "What are you?" he whispered. The creature didn't lift its head. Its tiny ribs shuddered with every breath, the kind of breathing Ethan recognized instantly. The failing kind. He reached in slowly, gently sliding his hand underneath the fragile body. It was ice cold despite the lingering heat of the stone. Too cold for anything to survive much longer. Its paws were disproportionately large, each tipped with delicate, needle-sharp claws that didn't fit any profile Ethan knew from years working as a ranger. As he cradled the bundle against his chest, the creature gave the faintest twitch, a thin cry that cracked something open inside him. Ethan had spent years trying to drown out echoes of the past, men calling out for help he couldn't give, the crushing guilt of being the only survivor from a canyon rescue gone wrong. He had promised himself he'd never again hold a life in his hands that he wasn't sure he could save. Yet here he was, clutching a dying scrap of fur to his chest as if instinct alone could pull it back from the edge. He stepped out of the rocks and into the open desert as the sky turned violet. A couple hiking along the trail slowed when they saw him holding the small creature. "Careful there," the man warned. "Some of the predators around here abandon the weak ones. Could be dangerous, could be sick." Ethan didn't answer. Not because the warning scared him, because it didn't. If anything, he felt a strange certainty settle into him. This wasn't a threat. This was something else. Something that, God help him, needed him. The hikers moved on, shaking their heads, leaving Ethan alone with the little life pressed against his heartbeat. Inside the cabin, he set the creature on a folded towel near the wood stove. He turned on the heat lamp he usually used for injured hawks and desert tortoises. Even under the warm glow, the little body barely moved. Ethan grabbed a bottle of electrolyte solution from his emergency kit, his hands working with the automatic steadiness of someone who had saved what he could and lost what he couldn't. The creature's eyes were still sealed shut, its breathing shallow. But as Ethan held the dropper to its mouth, a faint flicker of instinct stirred. The slightest stretch of its neck, the weakest attempt to swallow. It was enough to keep Ethan going. Minutes passed, then an hour. The night grew colder, though not as cold as a real blizzard. Still, the temperature shift in these desert nights could kill faster than people realized. Ethan knew tourists reading travel guides about home insurance, outdoor safety, or survival supplies would never imagine how quickly warmth vanished once the sun dipped. He stayed with the creature through the entire night, dozing only in short, sharp breaths. When dawn finally painted the sandstone gold, he leaned closer, almost afraid to check. The tiny chest rose, slow but steady. "You made it," he breathed. For the first time in months, his voice didn't sound like a stranger's. The creature let out a small, hoarse sound, something between a kitten's cry and a wild cub's hiss. Ethan reached out, brushing a fingertip along its dark, velvety fur, and felt the warmth returning beneath the coat. In that gentle motion, something else returned too, a forgotten sense of purpose, a fragile spark he thought the desert had burned out of him long ago. He didn't know what kind of animal he had rescued. He didn't know why its fur was so impossibly black or why it had been left alone to die. But he did know one thing. Whatever this small creature was, it had just changed the course of his life. The creature slept for most of the morning, curled tightly in the towel beside the wood stove, its breathing shallow but no longer desperate. Ethan moved quietly around the cabin, afraid that even the sound of a cupboard closing might break the thin thread of life the little thing was clinging to. Every few minutes he knelt down to check its temperature, to make sure the heat lamp wasn't too close, to lift its head just enough to offer another drop of electrolytes. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to. By noon, the desert sun had turned the horizon into a wavering blur. But inside the cabin the air felt strangely calm, almost suspended. When Ethan leaned closer, he noticed the creature's paws twitching, tiny claws flexing as if grasping at something in a dream. He smiled without meaning to. That simple movement, fragile but deliberate, felt like a small victory, one he hadn't felt in far too long. "Easy there," he whispered. "You're safe now." The creature stirred at the sound of his voice. Its eyes remained sealed, but its head tilted slightly, as if it recognized the warmth behind the tone. Ethan sat back on his heels, struck by the odd familiarity of the moment. He had once spoken like this to rookies under his care, men barely old enough to shave, but brave enough to hike into raging canyons. He had told them they would be okay, that he had them. Some came home, others didn't. That lingering guilt still tightened his throat whenever he remembered the rescue that went wrong, the one that pushed him out of service and into this quiet exile among red rock and desert wind. Now, somehow, saving this tiny life felt like a chance to breathe again. Hours passed. He managed to coax a little more fluid into the creature, then warmed a small amount of formula he kept for injured wildlife. The moment a drop touched its lips, the creature let out a faint sound, almost impatient, and made a weak effort to reach for the bottle. Ethan let out a breath that bordered on laughter, determination that small shouldn't have been possible. But there it was. "That's it," he murmured. "Fight for it." As the sun dropped toward the horizon, the creature lifted its head fully for the first time. Ethan froze, watching as the small body shifted, paws stretching out across the towel. Even half-blind, it moved with a coordination that didn't fit an ordinary kitten. The limbs were longer, the paws wide and strong, and when the creature yawned, a set of tiny, needle-sharp teeth glinted under the warm light. It was only then that the color of its fur truly caught his attention. Not merely dark, a deep, velvety black, absorbing the glow of the stove instead of reflecting it. In the shadowed corners of the cabin, the creature almost vanished entirely, a living silhouette cut from the night. Ethan had seen melanistic bobcats a handful of times in old wildlife reports, but nothing with fur this dense, this uniform. He leaned in closer, careful not to frighten it. "What kind of animal are you?" The creature didn't answer, but its tail gave a slight flick, as if annoyed at the question. Ethan felt the corner of his mouth tug up again. Feisty. Good. Feisty meant alive. As evening fell, the desert cooled rapidly, the kind of temperature drop that startled tourists who thought the heat lasted all night. Ethan adjusted the stove, then carried the creature, still wrapped in its towel, to the recliner. The old leather chair groaned under his weight as he settled in. He held the small bundle against his chest, and surprisingly, the creature relaxed instantly, letting out a faint hum that vibrated through its ribs. It wasn't a purr exactly, but something close, something wild. Ethan's heartbeat faltered slightly at the sensation. When was the last time he'd held anything without fear of losing it? Outside, coyotes yipped across the flats. An owl hooted somewhere near the ridge. The familiar desert chorus rose and fell, but inside the cabin, the world had narrowed to the quiet breath of the small creature resting against him. In the dim light, its black fur shimmered like it was woven from shadows, and for a fleeting moment Ethan wondered if this was what fate felt like, not a violent turning point marked by disaster, but a quiet, unexpected intersection with something that needed him as much as he needed it. He didn't realize he had drifted into sleep until a sharp little claw tapped his chin. Ethan jerked awake to find the creature staring at him with half-open eyes. 2 slivers of gold so bright they startled him. Gold eyes in a pitch-black body. Nothing about this made sense. "Well," he murmured, "there you are." The creature made a soft, clicking sound, then attempted to climb up his shirt, its paws surprisingly strong. Ethan steadied it, adjusting the towel nest around its body. Hungry again? He warmed more formula and fed it slowly. This time the creature drank with far more strength, gripping the dropper with tiny claws that pricked his fingertips. When it finished, it let out a satisfied huff and curled into the crook of his arm. Ethan sat there for a long while, not moving, barely breathing. A strange thought passed through his mind. Something about how many people spent their lives searching for peace through therapy, online health programs, financial advice, anything promising stability. Yet here he was, a broken man in a desert cabin, finding peace in the steady breathing of a creature he couldn't name. He looked down at it again. "I guess I need you just as much as you need me." Outside, the wind brushed against the cabin walls, and a thin sliver of moon climbed above the horizon. The creature shifted slightly, nestling closer, trusting him completely, despite being born of a world that seldom forgave weakness. Ethan tightened the towel around its small body, letting its warmth settle against him. He realized then that solitude didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. Whatever this little being was, whatever shadows it carried in that midnight coat, its arrival had pulled him back into the world, one shallow breath at a time. And as the night deepened, Ethan found himself whispering words he hadn't dared speak in years. "You're safe," he said softly. "I'll take care of you." The creature answered with a faint sound, soft but certain, as if promising something in return, something Ethan could not yet understand, but would soon be forced to face. By the end of the second week, the tiny creature Ethan had rescued no longer resembled the fragile, shivering bundle he'd found bleeding between the rocks. It had grown quickly, too quickly for any house cat, too powerfully for a bobcat, and its movements carried an uncanny coordination that made Ethan pause more than once. Still, despite the growing questions in his mind, he couldn't deny the comfort of having a living heartbeat moving about the cabin. For the first time in years, the silence around him felt less like punishment and more like company. The creature, Soul as he'd named it, followed him everywhere now. Its coat, a deep obsidian black, shone like polished stone under the Arizona sun, and when it moved, its muscles rippled with a sleekness that hinted at something athletic, something wild. Saul's eyes were open fully now, brilliant gold, shockingly bright, and they seemed to study the world with a depth too mature for such a young animal. Ethan often caught himself staring back, wondering what kind of wilderness could have shaped something that looked carved from the desert night itself. One morning, as Ethan prepared to head outside for firewood, Saul trotted to the doorway ahead of him. Not stumbled, trotted. The little creature's paws were already large, padded and silent, leaving almost no sound on the hardwood floor. Ethan blinked, remembering how awkwardly Saul had moved just a week prior. "You're growing fast," he muttered. Saul blinked once, as if agreeing. Outside, the day was blistering. The heat shimmered in waves over the sandstone, and the cicadas buzzed like a living engine. Ethan knelt beside the woodpile and began stacking logs into his arms. Behind him, Saul wandered freely, nose to the air, wide paws patting across the dust. For a moment, Ethan felt a rare sense of stillness, almost the kind of calm he remembered from before the canyon accident that changed everything. Then Saul froze. Its body stiffened, ears locking forward, tail straightening. Ethan turned just in time to see the creature's fur lift in a thin ridge along its spine. "What is it?" he asked softly. Saul didn't answer, but a low, unfamiliar rumble vibrated from deep within its chest. The sound was too resonant for something its size, too primal. Ethan stood, following the direction of Saul's gaze toward a distant canyon wall where the desert dipped into a maze of red stone and shadow. He strained his ears, expecting to hear coyotes or perhaps a stray dog. But instead, he heard nothing. Too much nothing. The desert never fell silent like that unless a predator was near. He slowly placed the firewood on the ground. Saul crouched lower, eyes trained on the canyon as if listening to a voice only it could hear. Then, after a tense moment, the creature relaxed, stepping back toward Ethan and rubbing its head gently against his shin. Ethan exhaled. "You scared the hell out of me," he murmured. But beneath his attempt at humor was something sharp, a new understanding settling uneasily into place. Whatever Saul had sensed out there, it wasn't small. That night, Saul's behavior grew even stranger. It paced the perimeter of the cabin, pausing often at the window that faced the canyon. Ethan watched from his recliner, muscles tense, wondering if this was simply instinct or something more deliberate. When the desert wind swept through the rocks outside, Saul's head jerked upward as if answering a distant call. Ethan tried to distract himself with a small pile of mail he'd picked up in town days earlier, mostly local notices, a reminder about wildfire prevention, and a brochure about financial planning that somehow always made its way into his mailbox. But even reading through information on home insurance and retirement planning couldn't pull his mind away from the creature pacing back and forth with a growing unease. Just after midnight, Ethan's eyes drifted shut. The day's heat had left him drained, and Saul had finally curled into a ball near the hearth. He let himself drift until a sharp sound jolted him awake. Not the wind, not coyotes, something deeper. A distant, resonant cry rolled through the canyon. It wasn't close, but it was powerful enough that the cabin's window panes quivered slightly in their frames. Ethan sat upright, breath caught in his throat. He'd heard mountain lions before. Working as a ranger meant being familiar with their haunting calls. But this sounded different, longer, heavier, like the echo of something massive threading through the desert night. Saul lifted its head immediately. The creature didn't shrink back or show fear. Instead, its golden eyes brightened with something that sent goosebumps racing across Ethan's arms. Recognition. "Don't," Ethan whispered. "Stay here." But Saul rose anyway, silent on its strong paws, and padded toward the door. Ethan stood quickly, intercepting him. He dropped to one knee, placing a hand gently on Saul's chest. "Whatever that is," he murmured, "it's not for you." Saul stared at him for a long moment, then let out a soft puff of air, not frustration, but something like acknowledgement, and walked back to its bedding. Ethan watched the little creature settle again, but the unease didn't leave him. If anything, it deepened. Over the next few days, things escalated. Saul grew stronger, its movement sharper, its instincts keener. It began practicing short leaps across the furniture, landing with impossible precision. It stalked shadows across the room with the focus of a mature predator. And outside, during Ethan's morning chores, Saul often stood with ears angled toward the canyon, waiting for something only it understood. One afternoon, while Ethan was repairing a section of fencing behind the cabin, he heard a sound he hadn't expected. Footsteps crunching on gravel. Human. He turned to see a tall man approaching through the heat. Haze, a tan uniform catching the light. Ranger Dalton. Ethan stiffened. The last thing he needed was a ranger questioning the animal he'd taken in. Dalton's expression softened a little when he recognized him. "Ethan Hale," he said. "Been a while." "Yeah?" Ethan replied. "Something wrong?" Dalton adjusted his hat, scanning the area. "Got a report from a pair of hikers. Said they saw a black mountain cat near your property. Big paws. Moved fast. Didn't attack, but it spooked them." Ethan's pulse stumbled. "Probably just a shadow in the rocks. Heat messes with depth perception out here." Dalton nodded, but his eyes stayed sharp. "Maybe. But keep an eye out, would you? We've had some strange activity lately. Something's roaming the back trails. Something bigger than usual." As Dalton walked away, Ethan's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the cabin, where Saul was peeking from behind the window curtain, golden eyes glowing faintly even in the daylight. That night, Saul slipped out of the open window while Ethan slept. He didn't realize it until the early morning when he found the window screen nudged aside and a fresh set of paw prints stamped into the dust. The prints were larger than they should have been, shockingly large for something so young. His heart pounded as he followed them around the cabin and toward the ridge. A single line of prints, then 2 sets, then none. The desert swallowed the trail quickly. "Saul!" Ethan shouted, voice cracking across the canyon. For a terrible moment, there was no answer, only the rising heat of dawn and the distant rumble of wind. Then, from behind him, a soft, familiar sound. He turned to find Saul padding out from the shadows, unharmed, head lifting proudly, as if returning from some private quest. The creature walked straight to him and pressed its face against his knee, as if offering assurance. Ethan exhaled, weak with relief. But even as he scooped Saul into his arms, one thought chilled him more than the desert night ever could. Something out there had called to Saul, and Saul had answered. Whatever he had brought home wasn't just surviving now, it was awakening. By late July, Saul was no longer the fragile creature Ethan had found bleeding in the crevice. He moved with the grace of something born to rule the canyon, silent paws, rippling muscles under that uncanny jet-black coat, and eyes so bright they seemed to hold fire even in daylight. Ethan tried not to think about how fast it had happened, how each morning Saul seemed larger than the day before. But the unease that lived in the back of his mind grew heavier, like a stone he couldn't ignore. It didn't help that Saul had begun leaving the cabin at night. He would slip out through the cracked window, vanish into the shadows of the canyon, and return before dawn with dust clinging to his fur. Sometimes Ethan found faint traces of blood on Saul's whiskers, a smear no bigger than a pinhead, but enough to tell a story. Saul was hunting, not chasing lizards or beetles as any young animal might, but truly hunting. One morning, Ethan discovered the remains of a jackrabbit neatly arranged near the fence line. No signs of a struggle, no mess. A clean kill. A professional kill. Ethan wasn't frightened of Sewell, but he was frightened for him. There was a vast difference. When he called Maya Torres, he didn't know what he wanted to hear. Maybe reassurance, maybe an explanation, maybe a simple reminder that animals sometimes behaved strangely. She listened quietly while he described Saul's rapid growth, his nightly disappearances, his unsettling strength. "That's not normal," she said eventually. "Bring him in tomorrow. Early. I want to take another look." The next morning, Ethan loaded Saul into the truck. The creature lay calmly across the passenger seat, though his golden eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. When they arrived at Maya's small clinic, more of a converted ranch house than a medical facility, Saul walked in without fear, pausing only to sniff the air as if cataloging every scent in the room. Maya approached slowly, hands steady, voice soothing. "Hey there, big guy. Let's see what you're made of." She weighed him first. Ethan nearly whistled. 23 pounds? Already?" Maya frowned. "A normal bobcat this age would be half that, maybe less." She lifted Saul's paw gently, studying the wide pads, the long claws, the unusual spread of the toes. Then she checked his teeth, sharp, white, longer than a kitten should be. Saul tolerated it all, though his tail flicked in irritation. "Ethan," she said quietly, "I don't think this is any type of domestic cat. And honestly, I don't think it's a bobcat either." Ethan swallowed. "Then what is it?" "I don't know, but I can find out." She pulled out a small sterile kit. "I want to send a DNA sample to the Colorado Wildlife Lab. They can cross-reference with genetic archives, mountain lions, bobcats, hybrids, anything that might match. They've got one of the best research programs in the country. Expensive, but worth it." Ethan hesitated, thinking of his dwindling savings, the stack of overdue bills in his drawer, the pamphlet about health insurance and life insurance he still hadn't bothered to read. Money had always felt like a burden, but this mattered. "Do it," he said. Maya nodded. "I'll rush the order. We should know in a couple of weeks." On the drive home, Sewell rested his head against Ethan's arm, purring, or something like purring, but the sound was deeper, stronger, a vibration that felt like it resonated in Ethan's ribs. He tried to reassure himself that everything would be fine, that Maya would call with some rare species explanation, and life would continue as before. But as the sun dipped behind the buttes and shadows stretched long across the desert floor, Ethan felt a prickle of unease crawl down his spine. When night fell, that unease grew teeth. Saul paced the cabin restlessly, pausing often at the door as if waiting for Ethan to let him out. The canyon beyond seemed to pulse with life, an undercurrent he'd never noticed before. Coyotes yipped in the distance, then fell strangely silent. An owl hooted once and then vanished into the night. The desert listened. Ethan felt it in his bones. Around midnight he heard the sound again, the deep rolling call from the canyon. It wasn't close, but it vibrated through the cabin floor, rattled the windows, slipped into the cracks of the walls like a warning or a summons. Saul's head snapped up. He moved to the door, posture rigid, tail lowered but not in fear, recognition again, just as Ethan had sensed before. Something out there belonged to Saul, or Saul belonged to it. "No," Ethan whispered, stepping between Saul and the door. "Not tonight." Saul stared at him with eyes that glowed like molten gold. The creature's muscles tensed, but after a long moment he backed away. Ethan sank into a chair, heart pounding. He stayed awake for hours, waiting for the call to come again, but the canyon remained silent until dawn. The following afternoon, Maya called. Ethan answered immediately. "I need you to come by," she said. Her voice was tight, controlled. "We got preliminary results from the lab." Ethan felt his stomach drop. "Already?" "Yes. Ethan, I think you'd better sit down for this." He did, and he listened as Maya took a breath and spoke words that made the room tilt around him. "Saul isn't a bobcat, not even remotely. He's 99% match for puma concolor." Ethan blinked slowly. "A mountain lion?" "Yes, but not a normal one." Papers rustled on her end of the line. "There's a rare melanistic gene, almost unheard of in wild populations, and based on the markers, this isn't just any mountain lion. This is a giant morph variant. They grow faster, larger, stronger." Ethan stared at Sewell, who was sitting by the window, watching him with calm intensity. "How big?" he asked, quietly. "If the projections are right?" Maya hesitated. "When fully grown, he could be larger than any recorded mountain lion in the Southwest." The silence between them stretched until Ethan forced himself to breathe. "What am I supposed to do now?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But whatever he becomes, you were the one he imprinted on. That matters." After the call ended, Ethan sank to the floor beside Saul. The young creature stepped onto his lap, curling against him, as if sensing the storm forming inside him. Ethan rested his hand along that impossibly dark coat. "A mountain lion," he murmured. "A giant one." Sewell pressed his forehead to Ethan's chest, a quiet reassurance. Ethan closed his eyes. He wasn't afraid of Sewell, not even now, but he finally understood something he'd been avoiding from the moment he found that trail of blood on the stone. Sewell wasn't just growing. He was becoming something the desert itself would one day fear. And Ethan was the only thing standing between that future and whatever call echoed in the canyon at night. By the time August settled over the desert, Saul's transformation could no longer be explained away as unusual growth or an odd quirk of nature. He was nearly the size of a medium dog now, though he moved with the fluid silence of a seasoned predator. His black coat shimmered under the sun like poured ink. His shoulders, once narrow and delicate, had broadened into the beginning of a powerful frame. And his eyes, those bright molten gold eyes, held an intelligence that made Ethan feel as if the creature saw straight through him. Yet Sewell wasn't dangerous with him. Not once. If anything, he had become fiercely protective. When Ethan walked the ridge at dusk, Sewell paced beside him, never wandering far. When coyotes yipped across the flats, Sewell answered with a low, warning rumble that made the smaller predators scatter. Ethan began to realize that whatever Sewell was becoming, he had chosen Ethan as his territory, his anchor, his world. But that didn't mean the desert intended to give him up. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the canyon and painted the sandstone cliffs with streaks of burning red, Ethan heard a sound he had learned to dread, a deep rolling call echoing through the canyon, a mountain lion's call, strong, mature, claiming territory. Saul lifted his head instantly from where he'd been lying near the cabin steps. His ears snapped forward, pupils widening to thin slivers. Ethan felt tension ripple through the creature's body like an electric current. "No," he murmured, instinctively placing a hand on Sewell's shoulder. "Stay with me." But the canyon answered again, this time layered, as if more than one voice sang through the stone. It wasn't the harsh cry of a warning, it was something else, something Ethan had never heard in all his years as a ranger, a summoning. Saul rose anyway, his muscles stretched under his dark coat, growing taut as a bowstring. For a heartbeat, he stood perfectly still, listening. Then, with a soft exhale, he stepped off the porch and began walking toward the ridge. Ethan followed quickly. "Saul!" The young mountain lion, because Ethan could no longer pretend he was anything else, paused, turning his head just enough for Ethan to see the dilemma burning in his eyes. Instinct pulled one direction. Bond pulled the other. Ethan's chest tightened. "Don't go," he whispered. But Sewell did, not running, not bolting, just moving with quiet conviction, as if answering a question older than the desert itself. Ethan trailed behind him, heart pounding until they reached the edge of the clearing. That was when Ethan saw them. 3 shapes perched along the canyon rim. Massive, silent, muscular. Their tan coats glowed under the fading light, tails flicking with slow, deliberate rhythm. 3 full-grown mountain lions watching him and Sewell with an unsettling calm. Ethan stopped cold. A single cougar was a threat. 3 was a death sentence. He swallowed hard, feeling the old training in his bones. Don't run, don't shout, make yourself tall, stay still. His voice trembled despite himself. "Soul," he whispered, "get back here." Sewell didn't move. He simply stood facing the 3 adults, his black coat stark against the red stone. One of the cougars let out a soft, chuffing sound, a greeting or an invitation. The others lowered their heads in a slow, almost ceremonial gesture. They weren't challenging him. They were welcoming him. Ethan felt the breath leave his lungs. Sewell stepped forward once, then twice, drawn by a pull older than memories or bloodlines. His body angled toward the canyon rim, his tail low, not submissive but receptive. For a moment, Ethan truly believed Sewell was walking away forever, returning to the world where he belonged. "Saul," Ethan whispered, voice cracking. The desert wind swallowed the sound. But then Sewell stopped. He looked back, not a glance, not a flick of recognition, but a deliberate, searching look that locked onto Ethan with startling clarity. The 3 mountain lions waited, patient as stone. Saul's ears twitched, his body shifted, and in a single, decisive motion, he turned away from them. He walked back toward Ethan and pressed his head gently against the man's thigh. The breath Ethan released shook with relief. He rested a trembling hand on Saul's shoulder. "Okay," he murmured. "Okay, I'm right here." The cougars didn't attack. They simply watched. Seemingly recognizing Saul's choice, they lifted their heads and retreated into the canyon shadows without a sound, disappearing as silently as they had come. Ethan and Saul stayed there for a long minute, listening to the night settle again, each breath grounding them in the moment neither of them fully understood. But the night wasn't done with them. The quiet broke suddenly with the crunch of tires on gravel. Ethan stiffened, spinning to see headlights cresting the ridge. A truck, then another. The engines rumbled low, kicking dust into the warm air. Ranger Dalton stepped out first, flashlight in hand. 2 other rangers followed, each scanning the area with the caution of men who expected trouble. "Ethan," Dalton said, "we need to talk." Sewell moved immediately, placing himself between Ethan and the men. His back arched, a warning growl rumbling from deep in his chest. One of the younger rangers reached for his tranquilizer rifle. "Easy," Ethan snapped. "Put that down." Dalton narrowed his eyes. "We got another report. A big black cat, not natural to this region, stalking the trail 4 miles out. Closer than last time." "You know anything about that?" Ethan didn't answer. His silence was enough. Dalton exhaled sharply. "Ethan, I have to take the animal in for observation. This isn't optional." But before Ethan could respond, a sound tore through the night, deep, savage, and far too close. A gray wolf burst from the brush, its eyes wild, ribs visible, likely desperate from drought or pushed from its territory. It charged straight toward the group. The younger ranger stumbled backward. Dalton reached for his weapon. Ethan froze, and Sewell moved. He launched forward with shocking speed, landing between the wolf and the humans. His body seemed to double in size as he arched, fur bristling, tail sweeping low. The growl he released was no longer the voice of a juvenile. It was the voice of something powerful, ancient, dominant. The wolf skidded, snarling, its momentum halted by the sheer force of Sewell's presence. The 2 predators faced each other, breaths harsh, the tension between them sharp enough to split stone. The rangers stayed motionless, terrified to intervene. For 5 agonizing seconds, the animals glared at each other. Then, slowly, the wolf lowered its head, a gesture of submission. It backed away step by step until it slipped into the darkness and vanished. The desert fell silent again. Saul stood panting, sides heaving, then turned and walked calmly back to Ethan before sitting at his feet like a loyal dog waiting for approval. Ethan stretched a shaky hand toward him, overwhelmed. Dalton stared, stunned. The younger ranger whispered, "What? What kind of animal is that?" Ethan didn't answer. All he knew was this. Sewell had just risked everything to protect people he'd never met. A wild creature with instincts as sharp as the claws he carried had chosen to defend Ethan and anyone standing near him. Whatever Sewell was, by blood, by nature, by choice, he belonged to Ethan. Morning came slowly after the night of the wolf encounter, rolling across the desert in soft bands of gold that crept over the ridges and slipped through the thin curtains of Ethan's cabin. He hadn't slept. Neither had Sewell. The young giant lay stretched beside the door, awake but calm, as if guarding not just the cabin, but Ethan's very breath. Every so often, Sewell's tail flicked, responding to sounds Ethan couldn't hear, shifts in the wind, the distant scrape of talons, perhaps even the faint return call of the mountain lions that had watched him the night before. Ethan brewed coffee with shaking hands. He kept replaying the scene, the gray wolf lunging from the shadows, the rangers panicking, and Sewell rising like some mythic creature pulled straight from the old stories of the Southwest, silent, black as volcanic glass, unyielding. He had seen courage in men during rescue missions. He had seen fear, too. But what Sewell had displayed was something different, something that felt both instinctive and impossibly deliberate. Protection. When Sewell glanced over his shoulder as if checking on him, Ethan felt the weight of that moment settle deeper into his chest. By 9 o'clock, Ranger Dalton's truck rolled back up the dirt road in a slow crawl. The sight should have filled Ethan with dread, but after last night he felt strangely steady. Saul stood and walked to the window, watching the rangers approach with quiet patience. Dalton stepped out, his expression tight, not with anger, but with something closer to conflicted amazement. Behind him came the younger ranger and a woman Ethan recognized, Dr. Maya Torres, climbing down from the back seat with a folder clutched against her chest. "Ethan," Dalton called, "can we come in?" Saul growled low, a reminder of the previous night. Ethan placed a calming hand on the mountain lion's shoulder and opened the door. "Come on. He won't hurt you unless you make him think you're hurting me." "That's reassuring," the younger ranger muttered under his breath, earning a sharp look from Maya. They stepped inside carefully, their eyes pulled toward Saul the way people stared at a wildfire, fear and fascination mixed together. Saul sat beside Ethan, upright and regal, as if he understood that this was not a moment for instinct, but a moment for judgment. Maya opened her folder with trembling fingers. "Ethan, I think you know this already, but I'll say it plainly. Saul is a melanistic mountain lion morph, a genetic variant so rare most biologists don't believe it exists. His DNA shows markers for accelerated growth, elevated muscle density, and an unusually high cognitive profile for big cats." She closed the folder. "We've never seen anything like him." Dalton stepped forward. "And that's the problem. Wildlife regulations say animals like him can't be kept as pets. They're apex predators. They're unpredictable. They're dangerous when they mature." Ethan bristled. "He protected you last night." Dalton held his gaze. "I know, and that's the only reason we're not here with tranquilizer rifles." He sighed heavily. "But Ethan, the law doesn't bend easily, and even if it did, you're asking us to trust something that could kill a full-grown elk when he's older." Sewell's head lifted at the sound of Dalton's raised voice. Ethan gently scratched the fur behind the big cat's ear until he relaxed. Maya exchanged a glance with Dalton, then stepped closer. "There, "Might be another way," she said quietly. "A special exemption. Rare, but it exists for cases that provide therapeutic benefit. It requires strict conditions, fencing, supervision, documented reports, annual inspections, and massive liability insurance. But it's the only way Saul can legally stay with you." Ethan blinked. "Insurance? For him?" Dalton nodded. "Think of it as wildfire coverage, but for claws." Ethan almost laughed despite the tension. The thought of filing claims for a creature like Saul seemed surreal, yet he understood the sentiment behind Dalton's dry attempt at humor. He rubbed Saul's shoulder gently, feeling the steady strength beneath the coat. "What would happen?" Ethan asked slowly. "If I said no? If I refused the permit?" Dalton hesitated. "Then I'm legally obligated to take him." Saul stood instantly, muscles coiling, tail sweeping the floor in a slow arc. A single, thunderous growl slipped from him, deep, resonant, enough to vibrate the floorboards beneath their feet. Dalton raised both hands. "Easy. I'm not saying I want to. I'm saying that's the law." Ethan placed both hands on Saul's sides, calming him. "I don't want to lose him," he said, voice thick. "He's the only reason I came back from what happened. I didn't ask for him, but he found me, and I'm not throwing him into a cage just because he's different." Maya stepped forward, gentler this time. "Then accept the exemption. Let me document his behavior and oversee his health. Let Dalton monitor the property. Let Saul stay with the man he chose." Ethan looked down at Saul. The young lion looked back with unwavering trust, the kind of loyalty Ethan had never expected from anything wild. His decision formed quietly, without fanfare, like a stone settling into place. "Tell me what I need to sign," he said. Relief washed over Maya's face. Dalton nodded, though wariness still flickered in his expression. The younger ranger stepped outside to radio the approval. Inside the cabin, the air felt lighter, a storm passing even though its winds had left everything changed. As they worked through the paperwork, Saul lay beside Ethan, occasionally lifting his head to nudge the man's hand as if sensing every emotion he carried. When the final signature dried on the page, Dalton folded the documents and gave Ethan a long look. "Ethan, take this seriously. Saul's still growing. He's not done becoming whatever he's going to be. And one day, you might have to choose between letting him stay or letting him go." Ethan swallowed hard. "I know." When the rangers left and the dust from their trucks finally settled, Ethan stepped outside with Saul beside him. The sun was low now, turning the sky into a molten ribbon of orange and violet. The canyon breathed softly. Somewhere far off, a mountain lion called into the fading light. Saul listened. His ears twitched. His chest rose and fell with slow, steady breaths. Ethan braced himself for the creature to turn toward the call, to step into the wild where he undeniably belonged. But Saul stayed. He gazed toward the voice, thoughtful, almost reverent. Then he pressed his side against Ethan's thigh, choosing the man with the same quiet certainty he'd shown on the night the three adults appeared. "You can go any time you want," Ethan whispered. "I won't hold you." Saul huffed softly, rubbing his head against Ethan's hip. The message was unmistakable. The wild had called him. But he had made his choice. Night came gently over the desert. As the stars emerged one by one, Ethan and Saul stood together on the ridge. The man and the creature fate had stitched into each other's lives. A breeze rustled across the canyon, carrying with it the faint chorus of distant wildlife. Saul lifted his head and answered with a low, rolling sound, not the cry of a cub anymore, but the voice of a young titan announcing his place in the world. And when the echoes faded, he stayed by Ethan's side, not tamed, not owned, but choosing, again and again, to remain.